Good morning. We'd like to welcome you to another edition of the Sunday School Review. This week's Sunday School lesson is entitled Josiah Celebrates Passover. Josiah celebrates Passover. Now, if I were to give this lesson an alternate subject, I would call it Reform under King Josiah. Now, we talked briefly about King Josiah last week. Last week, we were talking about King Hezekiah. And I said last week that out of the 28 kings that Judah and Israel had, there were only 3 that were godly, or 3 that was good kings. Joash, Hezekiah, which we talked about last week, and Josiah. Josiah was considered, or was, the last good king of Judah. After the reign of Josiah, things went progressively downhill and did not recover. So Josiah was the last good king or godly king of Judah. Now, our lesson is taken from 2 Chronicles, the 35th chapter, verses 1 through 6, and verses 16 through 19 of 2 Chronicles. Now, the author is the prophet Ezra. The prophet Ezra is the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now, there are 2 outlines in our lesson today. The first outline is restoring authentic worship. That's 2nd Chronicles, verse 35, verses 1 through 6. The second outline is God hears and responds to our cries. That's 2nd Chronicles 35, 16 through 19. Now, let's bring us up to date to where we are now. That is reform under King Josiah. That's my alternate title, reform under King Josiah. Or the lesson is Josiah celebrates the Passover. Now, how did we get to this point? Josiah began his reign at 8 years old. He is probably the youngest king in world history. Josiah began his reign at age 8. And we're going to find the account of Josiah's reign is listed in 2 Kings, 2 King chapters 22 and 23. 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23 talks about the reign of King Josiah. And also in our lesson, chapters 34 and 35 of 2 Chronicles gives us the same account. That is the reign of King Josiah. As I said, Josiah began to reign when he was 8 years old, and he reigned for 31 years, from age 8 until I believe about 39, 39 years old. So what happened? Josiah's father, whose name was Amon. Josiah's father was king. He was king. His name was Amon. Now, we can find that in 33, and probably it's about the verses 2, 33 of 2 Chronicles. His father, we'll see that in the 20th verse. we'll see Manasseh, sounds like Manasseh, but the SEH, Manasseh, was his grandfather. Amon was Josiah's father. Both of those kings, that is, Josiah's father and grandfather, were wicked kings. They had polluted the temple, among others, but they, before him, the two kings immediately before him, his grandfather and his father, they were wicked kings. They had idols, worship, all in the temple. And all of these things were in the temple. So basically now, they had even taken the Ark of the Covenant out of the temple. And we said a couple of weeks ago, the Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of God. So in other words, they had kicked God out of the temple and they had brought in idol worship. So what happened? As I said, chapter 20, 34 and 35 of Second Chronicles, also in Kings, the 22 and 23, chapter 22 and 23, Second King, talks about Josiah's reign. Let's read from verse 1, well, 1 and 2 of chapter 34. This is talking about Josiah's reign. It says, Josiah was 8 years old. This is verse 1 of 34. Was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. So he reigned for 31 years. He was 8 when he took the reign, and he reigned for 31 years. So he was 39, age 39. Now, verse 2 of 34, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in the ways of David, his father, and declined neither to the right or the left. Now, as I said, Amon was his father, but when he said David, his father, we're talking about David, his ancestral father. Let's be clear. So verse 2, and he did which was right in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in the ways of David, his father, and declined neither to the right or left. So we are referring to David, that is King David, his ancestral father, who was one of the good kings, okay? So that's who we're talking about here. So Josiah, as I said, was one of the godly king, one of the three godly kings. And he walked after his ancestral father, David. So let's go. That was verse 1 and 2 of Josiah. Not Josiah, but Chronicles, Second Chronicles. Now, our lesson picks up at verse 1. So let me just cover this. We'll cover it in the lesson too. So Josiah took the reign at 8, and 18 years, in the 18th year of his reign, that's Josiah. At that time, he was about 26 years old. He was still a young man. He instituted reform of the temple at Jerusalem. So he tore down the idol worship that his father and his grandfather had erected. He tore that down. So Josiah brought reform. That's why I give the alternate title, Reform under King Josiah. So in the process of restoring the temple at Jerusalem, a book of the law was found. They found a book of the law. They brought it to the king, and it was read from that book. And that was an eye-opener for King Josiah. And when it was read, he rent his clothes. He realized how far into idolatry that the nation had sunk. So he decided to institute reform. Now, as we know, from age 26 to 31, we only talk about 13 years, but there was reform in Judah for a while, about 13 years, from Josiah's 18th year in office. As I say, he was 26 then. He took office at 8 years old, and in the 18th year of his reign, that's when they was restoring the temple, and the book of the law was found. It was read, and that was an eye opener. Josiah saw how far the nation had slipped into idolatry. As I said earlier, they had kicked God out of the temple. They had taken the Ark of the Covenant out of the temple. That represented God's presence. They had brought in idol worship, idols. So Josiah instituted reform. Okay, he instituted reform. So our first outline is restoring authentic worship. And the Passover, we're talking about the Passover. The Passover was one of the feasts that the children of Israel was required to keep. Now, the Passover represented their deliverance from the Egyptian bondage. They were required to keep that. And most likely they hadn't had that in a while. So he brought back, this was in many years perhaps, there was the first time that the Passover had been celebrated. And this is where we get our title, Josiah Celebrates Passover. The first verse 1 of 35, that is 1 through 6. Moreover, Josiah kept a Passover unto the Lord in Jerusalem, and they killed the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. Now, Josiah wanted to make sure, after it was the law was read, he wanted to make sure that it was done as it was to be carried out. This is not a sham. We want to, as they say, we want to go back to the original documents. Go back to David. We want to go back to the original documents and see how it was done, how it's supposed to be done, and we want to carry it out in that exact manner. Let's read verse 1 again. Moreover, Josiah kept the Passover and unto the Lord in Jerusalem, and killed the Passover on the 14th day of the first month. And he set up the priests in their charge and encouraged them to service of the house of the Lord. As I said, he wanted to make sure that let's go back to the original documents and do this thing like it's supposed to be done. Okay, that's verse 3. And he said unto the Levites that taught all Israel, which were holy unto the Lord, put the holy ark in the house which Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, did build. Okay, as I said here we see it here. He said, unto the Levites that taught all Israel, which were holy unto the Lord, put the holy ark in which Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, did build. In other words, as I said, they had taken the Ark of the Covenant, which represented the presence of God, out of the temple and replaced it with pagan worship. He said, put it back. That's the first, well, that's one thing you do. Put it back. As I said, it was restored and found in this book. They said, put it back. Okay, let's finish reading verse 3. And it shall not be a burden unto your shoulders. Serve now the Lord your God and his people Israel. In other words, we want it done according to the letter of the law. We want it done right. Verse 4. Prepare yourself by the house of the Father after your course, according to the writing of David, king of Israel, and according to the writing of Solomon and his son. In other words, we want to go back to the original document. David and Solomon. This was how it's done. We want to do it exactly that way. Okay? Verse 5. And stand in the holy place according to the division of families of the fathers of your brethren, the people, and after the division of the families of the Levi. So, as I said, we want to do it the way it's supposed to be done. This is how it's supposed to be done. We want to do it that way. That's verse 5. So now let's go to verse 6, which is the last verse in our first outline. Let's go to verse 6. So kill the Passover and sanctify yourselves and prepare your brethren that they may do according to the word of the Lord by the hand of Moses. In other words, let's go back to the original sources here. Now, that's the end of that outline, but I want to read a couple of verses beyond there, namely verse 7 and 8. And Josiah gave to the children, to the people of the flock, lambs and kids, and for the Passover offering, for all that were present, to the number of 30,300 bullocks. These were of the king's substance. In other words, it didn't matter if you were poor and didn't have the money to buy a lamb or buy a sacrifice. Josiah provided everyone the means to sacrifice. Let's look at it again. He said he gave to the people flocks, lamb, kids, that means goats, all for the Passover offering for all that were present. So everybody that was present had an opportunity to sacrifice. To the number of, it was 30,300 bullocks. These were of the king's substance. He gave from his own wealth animals sufficient for everybody to sacrifice, the families to sacrifice, like it was supposed to be done, okay? And verse 8 says, and his princes gave willingly. They gave a free will offering unto the people, to the priests, and to the Levites. So not only did the king, that is Josiah, give from his own stock animals to be sacrificed, his princes gave freely too. Okay, so there was no excuse that they could make, the people could make. And they did celebrate for many years the Passover as were required. Okay, is what was one of the religious festivals that was required to take place. Okay, which had not been taking place. So that's what happened. That's where we get, again, Josiah celebrates the Passover, and he made it possible that every person that was there was able to participate. And let's look at, as I said already, chapters 22 and 23 of 2 Kings gives us the same account of Josiah's reign. And verse 22, verse 1 and 2, we read that in Chronicles, talking about he began to reign at 8 years old, and he did what was right and what was right in the sight of the Lord. And he followed in the footsteps of his ancestral father David. Okay, but also I want to look at verse chapter 23 of 2 Kings, verse 3. I'll do 3. Verse 3. This is 2 King, the other account of King Josiah's reign. And so Josiah, and this is going to be talking about, made a covenant with the Lord and the people, also the people. Let's read from the account of 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 3. And the king stood by a pillar and made a covenant before the Lord. We are talking about King Josiah. That's who we're talking about, King Josiah. The king stood by a pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes, and with all their heart and with all their soul to perform the words of this covenant that were written in the book. Now, this is important here. And all the people stood to the covenant. So we find that, as I said, reform under Josiah. So he himself made a covenant with the Lord as well as the people. Now, as I said, because he reigned for 31 years and he instituted reform at year 18, as when he was 26, and he died when he was 39. So reform lasted. Now, after him, his son took over, and as I said already, things went progressively downhill and did not return for Judah, king, for the southern king, that is Judah. So, okay, so that things will reform lasted basically 13 years during the remainder of King Josiah's reign. And after that, his son took over and things went downhill and did not recover. Okay, for Judah, as we talked already several weeks ago, the northern kingdom, that is Israel, had already been taken over by the Assyrians. And at this point, only the southern kingdom, that is Judah, remained. So that's where we are. Josiah instituted reform, and the reform lasted the remainder of his tenure from age 26, from his 18th year until for 13 years later. The subject, as I said, was of this outline is restoring authentic worship. That is what Josiah is noted for. That is, he restored the Passover. He brought back the institution of the Passover, which had not been celebrated, no doubt, for many, many years because of idolatrous and wicked kings. Okay, now we have a good king, and he instituted reform, cleaned up the temple, and brought back true reform, authentic reform in Jerusalem. Now, let's go to our second outline. Our second outline, let's go back to Chronicles here. Our second outline is 2 Chronicles, verse 35, chapter 35, that is verse 16 through 19. Let's pick it up at 16. So all the service of the Lord was prepared the same day to keep the Passover and to the burnt offering and to the altar of the Lord according to the commandments of King Josiah. Children of Israel that were present kept the Passover at the time and the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days. As I said earlier, Josiah made it possible for everyone to be able to take part in that required celebration. That Passover represents deliverance from Egyptian bondage. Let's 18. And there was no Passover like to that kept in Israel from the days of Samuel the prophet, neither did all the kings of Israel keep such a Passover as Josiah kept. In other words, he brought back, as the first outline, authentic worship. Neither did all the kings of Israel keep such a Passover as Josiah kept. I mean, Israel, we talk about kings of Israel, Israel, the divided kingdom, Judah and Israel. In other words, and namely, as I said earlier too, Israel, that is the northern kingdom, had already been destroyed for idolatry much earlier than Judah was taken down into Babylonian captivity. Now, as we know, not at this time, but Judah was eventually taken in Babylon and into captivity in Babylon. They were, because as I said earlier, things went downhill after Josiah. So the reform was short-lived, namely 13 years during the reign of the rest of the reign of Josiah. And as I said here, Israel didn't keep it. Israel didn't keep it. Then the northern kingdom didn't keep it. And the priests, the Levite, and all Judah and Israel that were present and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In verse 19, which is the last verse in our lesson, and the 18th year of the reign of King Josiah was this Passover kept. And I already mentioned that several times already. It was the 18th year of Josiah's reign at the age of 26 when he brought back authentic worship in Jerusalem. Like I said, removed the idols, brought back the Ark of the Covenant, and instituted, as we'll say, true reform in Jerusalem once again. But it was short-lived. So the subject, I gave the alternate title, Reform under King Josiah. The reform went well, as they say, as long as it lasted. Okay, it went well. And Josiah is considered one of the last good kings of Judah. And that's our lesson today. Josiah celebrates Passover. We'd like to thank you for watching. We ask you to join us next week for another edition of the Sunday School Review. Thank you.